Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. So on June 27th of last year, we released an episode about the Wagner Group. And I think for anyone who's unfamiliar with the Wagner Group, it would be a good re-listen for you. And we had a really interesting conversation at the time about the Wagner Group, the role it was playing as this strategic arm of the Russian government. The Wagner Group, it was a private military corporation headquartered in Russia, very closely aligned with the Russian government. It was led by Prigozhin, a former caterer, someone who spent time in prison, and rose to be a real confidant of Vladimir Putin. Of course, that all changed because in June as well, right before actually we recorded that episode, Prigozhin effectively turned on the Russian government. There was a brief coup attempt, and we recorded the episode at that time immediately after that attempted and failed coup. So there was a lot of speculation about what the future of Wagner would look like, and how the Russian government would try to sort of preserve the assets of the Wagner Group while not allowing them to act independently, or Prigozhin to act independently in the way that he had. Now, at the time, the sentiment of our guest then was that Wagner had assets and relationships, particularly in Africa, that made Wagner important, and likely meant that the process of transforming or integrating Wagner's Africa operations would at least be gradual and be complicated. So that was back June into July. But towards the end of August, Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash. I don't think anyone was supposed to mistake that plane crash for an accident. And that raises, I think, further questions about how Russia will be able to engage in Africa, kind of post this coup and post the killing of Prigozhin. In the midst of its ongoing brutal war in Ukraine, Russia continues to be very active in Africa, I would say, because Russia, like China, apprehends the vulnerabilities and the strategic importance of events on the continent. So after that longer than usual introduction, perhaps just to set the stage and to refer back to that previous episodes, I want to introduce our guest today, Dr. Joseph Siegle, who's going to share with us about Russia's current Africa operations and the Cold War and security dynamics in Africa more generally. Dr. Siegle is the Director of Research at the National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies in the United States. So Dr. Siegle, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate having a chance to be on.
Excellent. So I wanted to start by asking you about kind of we'll start maybe with structure and then go to objectives of Russia's engagement in Africa. So what has been the structure of Russian operations in Africa, and how have they shifted kind of from June, July of last year to where we are today?
Well, I think it's helpful to recognize that Russia's engagements in Africa have not been conventional. So, Russia hasn't been doing the things that a normal great power would do, of building up economic ties, trade, investment, development assistance. It hasn't been really investing in security cooperation. It doesn't really do a lot, even in terms of social, cultural, educational types of initiatives. Those are the ways that most bilateral relations unfold, and you build up longer term partnerships and recognition and support in these countries. The ways that Russia have gained interest have been through irregular channels, such as the deployment of the Wagner mercenaries, through disinformation, through election interference, through opaque, mining resources for arms deals, all of which are packaged as a way of propping up usually authoritarian leaders who are vulnerable, who don't have a lot of popular support. And so Russia, like it's done in Syria with Assad, becomes the key international patron and therefore a big leverage maker, even though it isn't investing very much. As a point of reference, Russia probably accounts for less than 1% of the foreign direct investment going into Africa. Still, because of these other irregular methods, it has significantly increased influence in recent years. Now, in terms of changes since Prigozhin's demise, I think that's still playing out. Prigozhin was the center of a lot of these networks, and many of them, again, are irregular, often illegal, and yet they bring considerable influence to Moscow. So they've wanted to retain them, but it is harder for a state to do some of these things than it is for a individual who has a myriad of business ties. Moreover, Wagner provided Russia plausible deniability for the human rights abuses that Wagner is associated with in every place that it deploys. And so, Russia has said after Prigozhin's death that, those contracts with dictators in Mali and Central African Republic, in Eastern Libya, those are with the Russian government, not with Wagner. And so they've taken ownership of that, and with it is going to come some of the reputational cost. So I think it's still playing out in terms of what this is, how this is going to go. For now, I would say it's, I think the levels of engagement, the levels of support are fairly, similar to what they were back then. And the Russian military is trying to figure out how to keep it going while fighting, while conducting their invasion in Ukraine. And there are some reports that Russia has been trying to recruit convicts out of Russian prisons or out of Ukrainian prisons in areas that it occupies in eastern Ukraine, and in that way creating a force that it continued to send to Africa as part of these mercenary groups.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that very, very good and effective explanation. I want to just probe down on a few of those points. You mentioned how Wagner provided some plausible deniability for some of the human rights abuses and probably corruption and other kinds of abuses as well that we saw. At a certain point, even before the coup, that plausible deniability was eroding because it just became more and more clear the level of integration between Wagner and the Russian state. Does Russia care about that anymore? I mean, are they looking for deniability around some of these human rights abuses, or is that sort of a sunk cost at this point?
Well, I think as part of Russia's narrative that it is there as a savior, as a supporter of African security without any of the strings attached that come with Western assistance, meaning human rights concerns and promotion for democracy. It doesn't want to be seen as conducting human rights violations. Human rights violations in Africa, where if Russia is seen as the actor behind that, could very much torpedo its image as as being an alternative to the West. I think that could
Right.
very quickly inflame and alienate African support. That
Right.
said, and to your point, I mean, uh, Russia realizes it doesn't have a lot of reputational cost to lose, and most of the deals, I think it's important to remember, these are with dictators for the most part. They're not with representative, democratic systems, and
Right.
so the support they need is really with those leaderships, those regimes, not with the general population.
Yeah. Now, that is fascinating. So it does seem, there's some awareness of reputational risk, but ultimately their clients are the dictators they're keeping in power. You described the strategy of relatively low investment, being patrons of dictators. It seems to me that it is the more dictatorial countries that have gone to Wagner, but there still is, even in the more democratic states in Africa, there's still generally a different view of Russia than exists in, say, North America and Europe, right? That they have a bit more reputational capital in the continent in general, even outside of places where Wagner is directly involved. Would you say that's accurate?
Um, it's complex.
Mm-hmm.
So I would describe it in there's layers of
Yeah.
support within Africa for Russia. There's this first layer of coup leaders and other autocrats who don't have other international supporters recognition, and so Russia gives them that and it helps keep them in power,
Mm-hmm.
frankly, with their support. There's another layer of authoritarian government that is also under pressure domestically for lack of democracy, human rights abuses, and by keeping an open door, open channel communication, by flirting with Russia, they politically stave off, further pressure or scrutiny they might get from the West,
Hmm.
because they're trying to use it as a deterrent for more scrutiny. A third layer would be governments who want to play both sides, like
Hmm.
in the Cold War,
Yeah.
and think that they can get something more from the West by um, remaining open to Russia. There's a fourth category of countries that have historically been part of the non-aligned movement, and don't want to get in the middle of
Right.
any perceived new, Cold War competition. And so, while they do not support what Russia has done in Ukraine, they are more democratically leaning. They're not going to openly criticize Russia. And there's a fifth category that is clearly democratic and very strong on human rights issues and are criticizing Russia. I think to put it in
Yeah.
context again and to reflect that complexity, you know, of when there have been the UN votes condemning the the invasion in Ukraine, a majority of African countries have criticized Russia. Only one has voted in support of Russia, and there have been about 17 that have abstained from those votes. So it shows you the balancing act
Yeah.
that they're trying to project.
Yeah, I think you're really valuable explanation, in particular the comparisons to sort of the last Cold War. And in my political work, I use the language of Cold War a lot to describe, I think, our contemporary reality, that we are in a kind of second Cold War, and the history of European democracies in North America being, in clearly in kind of one Western camp, in the last Cold War, versus the kind of non-alignment posture that we saw in much of the third world. It seems like you're describing, in a way, a kind of continuation of that tradition of non-alignment as well in a lot of places. And non-alignment was complicated in the past; it's complicated in the present, right? Because non-alignment can mean leaning a little bit one way or leaning a little bit the other way, right? But it's still a kind of posture of trying to be outside of that, and it reflects maybe an understandable mistrust of the West's failure to line up action with intention.
It's interesting because, yes, the non-alignment movement was very strong during the Cold War, and there was a lot of ideological commitment to not wanting to be a part of either camp. But it's interesting because some of that language and even the term non-alignment has resurfaced since the Ukraine invasion. But it's different in that the so-called non-aligned movement actually includes Russia and China, and so there's this projection of non-alignment, but it is clearly China, especially China, and to a lesser extent Russia, are trying to co-opt that and say, well, we're also part of the non-aligned movement, and we're also on the side of the global South.
Right.
And so it's a lot murkier this time around, and a lot of there isn't as strong of an ideological position on the part of many countries from the global South. I think many are saying, we want the economic benefits of engaging with China,
right?
And they don't want to, raise the ire of Russia. So they're sitting on the fence in that way. But it's a bit different than what we saw in the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, I mean, one I think important comparison that works its way out into the sort of self-descriptions of Russia and China is that in the last Cold War, it was the democratic West against the communist powers, and there's not the same kind of like ideological consistency on the part of the sort of neo-revisionist powers. You talk about collaboration between Iran, Russia, and China that notionally have very different sort of ideological self-justification, but they are united by a common kind of opposition to the international rules-based order advanced by the democratic West. So it's, there's an ideological, there was a lot of ideological murkiness in the past, but it's even more sort of fuzzy now. It's the framing I use is kind of democratic world versus anti-democratic world, as opposed to describing there as being one consistent ideology. But your point on China, sorry, just to pick up on the China piece, you mentioned kind of the irregular nature of Russia's engagement in Africa. How would you compare that to China? Like, is China acting through more conventional, more regular channels in general? To what extent are the two sharing tactics or collaborating, or are they doing very different things in Africa?
I think they are working very differently, though there are some overlapping interests. So China has been much more institutional and sustained in its engagements in Africa. It has engaged in significant trade, about $250 billion of trade between Africa and China every year. And China has also been very active in trying to strengthen military-to-military ties, party-to-party ties, which is significant because it's it's trying to advance the one-party governance model, which, of course, Africa has a long legacy of. And China is investing and trying to strengthen its influence within the UN system and trying to mold some of the framing and language within the UN, including the UN Human Rights Council, in ways that are consistent with Chinese values and interests, and specifically diminishing individual human rights and focusing more on state rights. China, of course, has created a whole plethora of its own multilateral institutions as an alternative to the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, again, to enhance its influence. So China is much more institutional in what it's doing. It's also engaging in disinformation. It's also involved in propping up different authoritarians and it can gain more influence at in a hierarchical model just by having strong ties with the top without necessarily having the popular support and the scrutiny that would come with a democratic system. That's not to say it doesn't deal with more democratic governments in Africa, but it does see advantages in trying to maintain one-party governments on the continent.
Mm-hmm. So yes, some similar objectives, but use of quite different tools. And then just in terms of also following up to your response to the first question, and then I think after that, what we can talk about sort of strategic objectives a bit more. But kind of post Prigozhin, as there's been this transition, you mentioned the Russian government saying that they assume directly some of these contracts. Have those networks been able to transfer over, is your impression, or are there assets, individuals, networks that Prigozhin personally had that have been lost to the Russian government as a result of Prigozhin's death?
Well, certainly a lot has been lost because a lot was on a personal basis. And again, the influence wasn't just with the deployment of the mercenary forces, but it was then lining up disinformation messaging that helped to prop up these leaders and control the information space. It was about getting mining operations going that could be financed through different illicit, financial transaction mechanisms. And Prigozhin controlled, dozens of these firms that he was able to pull together. So he called all of this activity the orchestra, and he was the conductor of how it came together. And so you take the conductor out, and it's a lot of pieces to put together. It takes a dexterity that the Russian government doesn't necessarily have. And so the focus has been on maintaining some forces, the Wagner forces. A lot of those were loyal to Prigozhin, but they don't have many other options. And so the sense is that the force levels have been about the same as last year. And there's still a lot of disinformation coming in from Russia. It may not be as targeted, but it still hits the same themes of trying to say what a great job these authoritarian governments are doing, how all of the problems in these countries are a result of the West, especially France, and colonialism and the Western-based international order. And for countries that are poor and have a lot of grievances, some of these messages stick. So I think there's been more continuity than discontinuity.
Okay, that's a really good picture. So some loss, but more continuity on balance. You gave an interview in July of last year, and this is how I discovered your work was by reading this excellent interview you gave, and you identified 4 main strategic priorities for Russia in Africa. You said those priorities are, number one, to gain a foothold in North Africa to menace NATO's southern flank; two, to enhance perception of Russia as a great power; three, to undercut democracy and normalize authoritarianism; and four, to undermine notions of international rule-based order. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but anyways, I wonder if you could share a bit about those objectives, if you think it's the same or different than it was 6 months ago, and also maybe fleshing out just a little bit about what those objectives mean practically and why they're important to Russia.
Yeah, well, thank you, and glad you were able to see the interview. But I believe those four strategic objectives continue to define what Russia is doing. And I think it's important just to recognize that there are those strategic objectives, because a lot of times, people are caught up in the sensationalism of the mercenaries or these arms deals or the mining operations and see this as all criminality or opportunism. And I think it is important to step back, that there has been a lot of intentionality and there is a strategic aim behind what Russia is trying to do in Africa. And so, for the first objective, trying to gain a foothold in North Africa and along the Red Sea, Russia has been very focused on Libya, and it has been a larger arms supplier in Algeria. It's been trying to build relations with Egypt. It has been backing up Kais Saied's power grab in Tunisia. And, while the economic investments are still marginal, this accomplishes a couple of things. One, it poses a prospective threat to NATO, and it forces NATO to pay attention to what's happening on its southern flank. But it also tries to pull these North African countries into the Russian orbit. It also helps maintain authoritarianism in those governments. The Arab Spring was very threatening to Vladimir Putin, and so he's able to advance stability in his eyes by helping those regimes stay in power. It also provides access to potential naval port access, and this may be the most important part of this, is if Russia can gain enduring military presence in the Mediterranean or in the Red Sea, that's very much changes the security arrangements for NATO, but for maritime commerce that is passing through those very commercially important passageways in the Mediterranean through Suez Canal. We're already seeing what happens with the Houthis in Yemen, and so having Russian naval presence in the Red Sea would have the similar impacts. I think that would be the first strategic objective. The second is to gain, to inflate Russia's posture globally and undermine the West, the reputation of the West, the influence of the West. This has become more important since the second invasion of Ukraine, and as Russia is isolated politically, economically, it has become more important for Russia to appear that it is unhindered, that it continues to be welcome, has many friends around the world. And so, since the invasion of Ukraine, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister in Russia, has made at least 10 different visits to Africa, and trying to be very active, very public about how popular and engaged Russia is, and that Russia's interests need to be considered in every region of the world. So maintaining its posture as a great power. So Africa has become more important rather than less important to Russia since the Ukraine invasion. The third objective is about undermining democracy. I've alluded to this a couple of times, that this is important to Russia for two main reasons. One, uh, uh, Russia wants to normalize authoritarianism as an equally valid governance model that puts less pressure for change on itself. And it also helps Russia to gain entry points. It's a lot easier to form ties with an authoritarian government and in which you really need to just have a relationship with the top leader rather than trying to build popular support and connections from a whole host of power centers in a country. And we've seen in Africa, Russia has actively tried to undermine democracy in 24 countries. So it isn't just the places they deployed Wagner forces, but they've been involved in election interference. They have deployed the Wagner fighters. They've supported the coups. They've been undermining the UN, and then they're providing arms and other material support for authoritarian governments. And so this has directly contributed to the stagnation of democratic development on the continent, and again, serving broader interest. And then the last objective is about what kind of international order are we going to see? And this has been a big messaging focus of Russia that the current international order has failed. It's not working. It's exploitative of the global South. We need a new order, and of course, they're not really defining what that new order is. But the new order really is a lot like the old pre-UN order, which is really a lawless, transactional, might makes right type of order that Russia would thrive in relative to an order where there are some checks and balances and some scrutiny. And that's really at the heart of what the Ukraine invasion is about. Russia's challenging the current international order and respect for borders and territorial integrity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a great kind of overview of those objectives. We've talked a few times throughout this discussion about the use of resources in the pursuit of those objectives, and you've mentioned that these are relatively low cost forms of engagement. They still involve some cost, and it's interesting that in the midst of the war in Ukraine, which is obviously very important to the regime in Russia, they are still spending resources, manpower in relatively far away Africa. It does suggest that these objectives that they're pursuing are quite important. They're not just sort of passing preferences, but that there's an immediacy to their desire to realize these objectives, and probably that they see something about the importance of Africa that is not typically perceived in the West.
Well, you're right that there is some commitment of resources, and it is part of Russia's posture and geostrategic interest of wanting to be seen as a great power who has influence and interest all over the world. And so, I think the calculation is by spending a fraction of its foreign policy budget in Africa, it's able to advance that. It's also notable. I mean, Africa has 54 countries. That's more than any other region of the world. So at international bodies like the UN, that's a lot of potential votes.
Mm-hmm.
Russia sees advantages of trying to appeal to the global South on these narratives of an exploitative international system and a grievance-based message that this current system isn't working for you. And so it's a way of cultivating more support for its position at a low cost. And because Africa, is so much in need of resources, it is not going to be choosy often about where those
Mhm.
come from. And because of the complicated, political dynamics in Africa, where you still have a majority of authoritarian leading governments, it's um, an attractive target region for Russia. The potential impact, the potential influence that Russia can have in Africa is significantly greater than in places with more developed political systems, with more complex information systems that can critically examine these claims and push back on the torrent of Russian disinformation we're seeing in Africa.
Mhm. Now, in terms of disinformation narrative, one of the dynamics that I see in kind of Russian information warfare is to highlight some of the sort of social values debates, for instance, around trans issues in the West, and to use those debates as ways of trying to create contrast between itself and the West. Um, do you see are these kinds of contentious social issues being used in Russian narratives in Africa as well to try to create distance between Africa and the West?
They are. It's one part of several
Yeah,
main themes that are out there. Um, a lot of the focus on Africa is colonialism
right.
and exploitation and the Western-led international order and that being the cause of poverty. But Russia will try to exploit any polarizing issue.
Hmm.
And yes, we've seen this on issues of gay rights and um, very much trying to appeal to traditional values in supporting different governments in Africa that are restricting
Hmm.
gay rights, and in that way trying to align its governance model with traditional values where democracy is seen as foreign and threatening to those traditional values. Um, but as I said, uh, Russia, and I mean the insidiousness of disinformation is it's looking for any polarizing
Hmm.
narratives that are out there. Russia has, played up racial differences in South Africa as a way of trying to both appeal to the white-based
Hmm.
parties as well as the black-based liberation parties on the continent, um, and just fomenting what's already a very sensitive set of issues in that country.
Yeah. So with these narratives, the objectives you talked about, how successful has Russia been in advancing towards the realization of its objectives through its engagement in Africa?
Well, I think for the amount of resources and the time it's committed, it's been relatively successful um, uh, through its support of the coups, of which we've seen a series in Africa in the last couple of years. Russia has gained outsized influence that it didn't have in the Sahel in just the past couple of years. Um, Russia has strengthened its foothold in the Central African Republic, where it is the main international patron and, in fact, provides the presidential guard for the president there.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly in Libya, Russia continues to try to undermine the UN-backed government in Tripoli through its support of the warlord Khalifa Haftar, and who has made multiple attempts to physically seize Tripoli, and it's created the fiction of there being two competing governments in Libya. So again, that's a big prize for Russia. So the fact that it persists, I think those are successes for Russia. Russia has also been, I think, effective in promoting its narratives. And, we hear regularly Africans say, well, democracy has failed. That's why the coups were needed, which is exactly out of the Russian, disinformation playbook. This idea that the West is the source of all the problems that Africa faces, and so informationally, Russia has done very well. Again, without investing very much or not really doing anything that's contributing to stability or prosperity on the continent. Now, that said, I think over the last year we've seen a growing skepticism towards Russia in Africa. There is a recognition that Russia isn't really bringing that much, and a concern for the instability that Russia is bringing through the irregular tools that it's using. And we saw this demonstrably displayed at the Russia-Africa Summit in July in St. Petersburg, where only 17 of the 54 African heads of state showed up. In the previous Russia-Africa Summit 2019, 43 African heads of state were there. And it was very ironic at the time, but I think very telling that it was just before that summit when Russia pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal. This was the deal made with the UN that allowed the export of Ukrainian grain. So it's 33 million metric tons were going into global markets. It had helped reduce food prices. This is critical for Africa. So Russia pulled out of that deal, so it closed back off that supply chain, supply line of grain, and then bombed Ukrainian ports that were exporting the grain. So 180,000 metric tons of, 180,000 tons of grain were destroyed through those bombings. And this was right before the Africa Summit. And so I think it really palpably showed to African leaders the contempt Russia has for its interest, which, really were trying to open up supply markets for grains because food pressures, inflation were hitting the continent so hard. And so I think there's been growing skepticism towards Russia on the continent from leaders and governments that are responsive to public pressure.
Right.
And again, that doesn't include those that are tyrants that are able to cut deals without having to be responsive to their populations.
Just in terms of that timeline, I just want to clarify that. So the last the last Russia-Africa summit was when?
In July of 2023.
July of 2023, and the one before that was
in 2019.
2019. So that was pre further invasion. So it does show that I guess between all these things that are going on, the invasion, the important information you shared about the grain deal, a big drop in the number of heads of state going. So at least to say it's become more complicated to be seen. And your point about the grain deal, I think is really interesting. Like in terms of Africa's actual concrete needs, what's perplexing about Russia's partial success there is just how bad Russia's actions have been substantively for Africa. I mean, the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on food supply has been significant, of course, and also and you've talked about this previously, just how the Russian presence supposedly to solve security challenges is not solving those security challenges. Like the security situation continues to deteriorate in places where the Wagner Group are active. So you can see how maybe you can hope that there is going to be a growing backlash against Russian influence and a search for alternatives. But I guess to your point as well, that's varies depending on the ability of people that are affected by these things to actually have their voices heard and push their governments to respond to those dynamics.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And on the security point, the juntas in Mali in particular, but to a lesser extent Burkina Faso and Niger, had reached out to Wagner. Wagner has some 1,000 forces in Mali, which they're being paid for, about $11 million a month through cash in kind. But in the past 2 years, the security situation in Mali has deteriorated. There's been double the number of violent extremist events, triple the number of fatalities. And I think the luster of what Wagner can do is wearing off, certainly across the continent, but even within these Sahelian countries, and a growing recognition that they're not a game changer for the broader security situation. And in fact, they have been linked to a lot of human rights in Mali, in Central African Republic, in Libya, in Sudan. And so, I think there is a growing concern and wanting to have some distance with that on the continent.
Yeah. So let's kind of end with a look at kind of Western engagement. The West is used to thinking in terms of addressing Africa's, supporting Africa's needs in terms of food and education and those kinds of important areas of development. But it does seem that there is a security vacuum that the West is sort of harder placed to play a role in supporting the response to, and that has created more space for Russia. Are there ways that the West can do more to support African governments in responding to legitimate security challenges, and do so in a way that that provides meaningful alternatives to looking to Russia?
Absolutely, and I think this is a real central dynamic right now on the continent, especially West Africa. As I mentioned, the violent extremist groups have been expanding both in their capacity and their territorial control. They're now pushing out towards the coastal West African countries of Togo, Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and it's a big concern for the region. We're seeing millions of people displaced from these conflicts. That's contributing to the refugee and migration crises. That's putting a lot of pressure on Europe. So there are, these conflicts are not going to be contained in the countries. They're having regional and international effects. And it does come back to governance, though, because Europe had been ramping up its support for the Sahelian governments the last few years prior to this string of coups that we saw starting in 2020 in Mali, but then followed in Burkina Faso and Guinea and Niger. And with that, again, you had unpopular, illegitimate leadership, authorities come in, and they, especially the Malian junta, which was the first, quickly reached an agreement to bring in Wagner. There's evidence Wagner and the Russians were involved with the disinformation prior to that coup that had been fomenting protest. Russia was the first country to recognize the junta in Mali. And ever since, they have taken positions that have been really hostile to the West. So they've pushed out the EU, they pushed out the French. They recently pushed out the UN, which had a peacekeeping force there for a number of years, providing stability in the north. They've been pushing out the West African regional cooperation body, the ECOWAS, as well as the support they were getting from neighboring countries for their security. And so all these things, it's very paradoxical because in the midst of their security challenges, they're alienating all of their traditional security partners, putting themselves in a more vulnerable position while relying on Wagner. And it shows you the strength of the geopolitical dynamics and how they're playing out in the Sahel. And so, yes, the rest of the region is going to bear the security consequences, the instability from that. But yes, I think the West, wants to be involved in helping to accelerate the transitions in these countries back to civilian-led democratic governments. It is that sort of government that is going to be in a better position to deal with the insurgencies. And we know in fighting insurgencies, it's not just about firepower. The militaries in these countries have done a very poor job, and they've created a lot of human rights abuses that have further alienated populations and turned them against the governments and towards in support of the jihadist. And so civilian governments are going to provide a much more holistic approach, and sustaining security, but also providing development support, trying to provide local governance and justice mechanisms in these places, building the coalitions that are going to be needed regionally and internationally. And I think that's where the West can help provide the support to create those coalitions, and be ready to help with some of the resources going to be required for stabilizing these regions that have been under pressure. It would be important for the UN to get back in with their peacekeeping forces. It's gonna be a multinational effort to try to stabilize this situation, and it'll be a multi-year effort. And so I think it's really going to require all hands on deck.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, so and to make this more concrete with another specific example. So let's take a country like Nigeria, right? Democratic, civilian-led, obviously lots of challenges, and some acute security challenges, especially in the north and involving Boko Haram, right? So my sense is that Nigeria might welcome more Western engagement and support on the security front, and Nigeria seems to be one of these countries that takes a sort of non-alignment posture. So maybe there are big security issues. Nigeria is population-wise a massive country, very, very important. So we're not talking there about a case where I suspect we're not talking there about a case where Western support around security would be unwelcome or impossible. But I mean it's still a complicated place to engage for lots and lots of reasons. So maybe just using that as an example. I mean, how can we engage directly with governments where that engagement is possible, to help them on addressing some of these security challenges?
Yeah, I think Nigeria is a good case, and your characterization is a fair one. So I think there's multiple ways you would engage. And Nigeria, I should add, has resources, and it commits last I looked, $1.4 billion a year for its own security, and so it's putting significant resources into those efforts. And so a lot of what the Western engagement can be is helping to strengthen those security institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So they're more capable, they're more accountable, they're more effective, and the types of fighting we're talking about, these are happening within countries. It's not fighting a threat from outside. That's what militaries are trained for. So they're having to relearn and apply skills in ways that they haven't been prepared for, and and discriminating between who's a threat and who's just a citizen in these
Mm-hmm.
places. And we know this is hard, but this is what professional security forces need to do. Again, with the longer term vision in mind, that it isn't about crushing the enemy. It's about building popular support. It's that popular support in the end that's going to squeeze out these jihadist groups. There's a history of corruption in Nigeria, and so part of the support the West can bring is accountability structures and forensic accounting, and helping to expand mechanisms for ensuring that the resources in these countries are being as well used as possible. There's means of ensuring that the recruitment and hiring within the Nigerian military is merit based, so that you're getting the best people in leadership positions, and they're making decisions based on what's best for the security environment. So it's not just a financial deal. It's about building skills and capacities and institutions. And I think Nigeria is receptive to that, and so it's not a quick fix, but this is about what strengthening these African countries is about, and how you're going to have longer term impact, and how
Right.
you really sustain progress.
So the alternative Western engagement could be, when it comes to security, a kind of training, capacity building partnership, really focused on the area of security, working with security institutions to, but also to build up their accountability, their adherence to human rights norms, to try to help both address the security issues in the immediate, but the long term frustrations that populations have around corruption and human rights issues in security. And I think that could be a powerful alternative to what's being offered by Russia, which is we're gonna send in a few mercenaries who will be brutal in their approach, and officially fight against violent extremists, but in the end create the conditions in which they continue to grow and flourish.
No, I think that's a great summary and a really important point. That and on the one hand, let's not forget the West has been engaging Africa across a whole host of development, social, cultural, educational, economic, and security initiatives for decades, and hundreds of billions of dollars over the years. It far exceeds anything Russia has done. So let's not define what we're doing just by what the Russians are doing, or try to feel like we're competing with the Russians. And in the same way, let's not try to be like Russia in terms of what we do. If security, just because Wagner goes into these places doesn't mean we should then try to recreate a Wagner type of activity. We provide a very different comparative advantage that's going to be more stable, more sustainable over time, and building African agency, African capacity, that's a winning proposition on both sides.
Yeah. So I'm going to squeeze in one quick question at the end here, if that's right. I wanted to ask about, we've talked a bit about West Africa and the security issues there, but I want to ask about the DRC, major security challenges there, obviously, and growing criticism, I think, of MONUSCO, the UN mission there. In particular, focused on its inability to kind of resolve the security challenges, although many people I've talked to say things would be worse if it wasn't there. There's obviously regional tensions, especially with Rwanda, that kind of flow out of that dynamic. What is the risk that we'll see potential further escalation of conflict in the DRC in the year ahead, and what kinds of risks does the security situation there create for further involvement by Russia, for example?
Well, I think there is a strong likelihood that we could see escalation in the eastern DRC. There has been jockeying for influence for a number of years between Rwanda and Uganda, with the government in eastern DRC. There are lucrative cobalt and coltan mines in eastern DRC, as well as other mineral resources. They have been lucrative for Rwanda and Uganda, and they don't really they want to maintain the access. And Rwanda has maintained influence in eastern DRC through its support of the militia M23, and so there are these external actors that have benefited from the ongoing instability. Meanwhile, the government in the DRC is relatively weak. It also suffers from an unprofessional, poorly resourced and trained security force. So they aren't always very effective when they do deploy. MONUSCO has been in that region, and I agree with the assessment that things would be worse without them. MONUSCO provides some sort of buffer. It provides some sort of trusted entity on the ground. It also is an entity to provide oversight for human rights abuses, which some of these actors don't want. So they've been targeted for criticism, but a lot of that is self-interested criticism that is coming out. All that to say, it's complicated. Yes, when there's turmoil, when there's resources, Russia could try to exploit that. But so far, the government of the DRC has refrained from taking on Russian support. And this is a political rivalry that's playing out in terms of the insecurity. It is resolvable. It's not an intractable ethnic-based conflict, and it will require some regional and international forces to be engaged, provide some third-party negotiation and oversight, and hold each of the leaders accountable. They're all not wanting to get outmaneuvered and exploited through this, the border that they share.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Siegle, thanks for a great conversation today, and I wanted to add in the point about the DRC. I think it's so critical as well. The global economic implications, the cobalt and coltan that you mentioned, but also how our use of those products may be impacting conflict and exploitation in that region. So, but overall as well, your description of events in Africa, I think, reinforces a message that I've talked about on a few of these different episodes, and certainly in other parts of my political work, is just the importance of following and engaging with events that happen in Africa, and recognizing the relevance of those events to global security. Russia perceives its engagement in Africa as being a tool for advancing its global agenda, and insofar as we know that is completely contrary to the values the democratic world wants to advance, it underlines how our engagement is important as well. So I'll leave the last word to you, and then we'll wrap up. Anything I missed, anything I should have asked you, anything you want to add, and then we'll conclude.
Well, there's always more to talk about, but I think I would just echo the last point you made, that sometimes Africa and these issues that Africa is facing seem far off and not relevant to us. But I think it's important for your listeners and all of us to continue to pay attention, learn as much as we can, and understand how we can involve and be involved in a constructive way. The world is increasingly small, and what's going on in the Eastern DRC or the Sahel does have direct implications for us, and we in turn, our actions are having implications on how these conflicts and how these government authorities are organized. And so it is in our interest to be involved and to look at how we can play a constructive role.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Siegle, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for listening. We release these conversations about every 2 weeks, and we'll be back with another episode shortly. You can get Resuming Debate on all of your podcast platforms. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a review, and we'll be back with another episode in 14 days.